A Shot in the Dark by Silverpup. Chapter 36. There was a saying that his father used to tell him.
Real dwarves never cry for themselves, Dain.
His father, broad-shouldered and scarred, but always smiling in his memories, said as he gripped his shoulder.
They cry for others and keep their own tears inside.
He recalled those words often growing up because he found himself never able to cry for anyone. Not for his oldest brother who died in an orc raid when he was still a babe, nor for his second brother who died in an accident in the mines. He didn't even cry for himself, even when he injured his hand in a training match that sent his mother raving. Frin had cried a lot. Big hiccuping sobs that rattled his shoulders and made his breath hitch and turned his eyes red and puffy. He used to watch Frin cry with a great fascination because when Frin did something, he never did it halfway. His tears were always a spectacle that never failed to arouse the palace into a frenzy because even as children, Frin had always been the beloved one. It was not until after he died that Dain realized that Frin had never cried for himself. He and Frin had always been close growing up. It was natural, as they were close in age, and were both the youngest sons of their family. They had been grouped together before they had a chance to choose, but that was fine, because he would have chosen Frin eventually. He had to be close to Thorin as well, of course, but that was a different bond from the one he shared with Frin. Thorin he had always seen as an equal, someone he could share his problems and troubles with. But Frin had been something else. Someone he admired and followed around like a puppy because the Golden Prince had been everything Dain had aspired to be. Frin had been sunny smiles and easy laughter and flashing blue eyes. He was a mess of contradictions, choosing the bow as his main weapon, not because it was easy, but because he was so horrible at it. He insisted on becoming a stonemason because it seemed to him the most important job a dwarf could have. He never braided his hair and had worn it loose and free because he liked it best that way, even though it went against every tradition of their people. When Dain closed his eyes, he could still see Frin running through the halls, laughing with his golden hair billowing out behind him like a flag.
One day I will carve out a name for myself outside of the Thorin legacy,
his cousin had boasted one night as they hid away from a feast on a flight of stairs. He remembered that the marble floor had been gold, but he had been willing to endure it for the honey wine they had swiped.
People will remember me for more than just a son of Thorin.
The blonde had promised, his blue eyes bright against the darkness around him.
They will remember me for being Frin.
Dain had never thought of him as just another son of Thorin. He had always just been Frin in his mind. In Azanul Bazaar, he had not been there when his cousin had died in Thorin's arms. Instead, he had been fighting at the gates, avenging his fallen father and his people after they had been slaughtered by the orcs. It was not until later, after he had seen to his father and took command of the remaining forces, that he learned of Frin's fate. Died with a smile on his face and a horde of dead orcs around him, they had whispered in the camps. The Golden Prince, the greatest treasure of Erebor. Died with a smile on his face. It was something Frin would have done. Frin hated being sad, but he hated it more when others were sad over him. He would have spent his final breath reassuring Thorin because he never wanted to see his big brother upset. And the rumors had not lied either. When he finally saw Frin's body for the last time, the prince was still smiling, even in death. After the battle, Thorin had asked him to bury his brother in the Iron Hills until Erebor could be reclaimed. He had agreed and made the long trek home carrying the bodies of his father and best friend. There he had entombed them with his brothers and grandmother and then later his grandfather. It was there that Frin still laid, forever young and smiling in death as he waited to be buried among his people. Sometimes, when he had too much to drink or was coming back from a particularly ugly battle, he would visit Frin's tomb. There he would tell him about how his day had gone, or whatever new thing his son had done. Sometimes he even spoke of Thorin and Diz and the boys, if he was up to it. But mostly he would stand there and wonder why he had lived and Frin had died. Frin had been the gifted one, after all, the blessed prince that everyone loved. Dain had always just been second best, the shadow in Frin's light. Why did he live divine glory while his hero brought it away in the tomb? Perhaps it was the guilt of living a life that didn't belong to him that drove him to answer Thorin's calls for aid time and time again. Dain knew that he could refuse to help his extended kin, that his advisors and family wished it and did not understand his need to help them. He even knew that Thorin would not hold it against him in the least if he decided to take his army and go home. He had gone above the call of duty when he came to their aid against... He had gone above the call of duty when he came to their aid after Smaug fell. No one would blame him in the least if he walked away from Thorin's mad quest to challenge Mordor. But every time he thought of leaving or doing the most sensible thing anyone could do in his position, he remembered his kingdom with all of its riches. He recalled his people singing his glory, his reputation throughout the land, and a sad tomb in his mountain held a golden prince who never got this chance to live. People will remember me for more than just a son of Thorin. Frin, his cousin, his best friend, his hero, had vowed once, ignorant to the reality that he would not even live to see 50. They will remember me for being Frin. The world didn't remember the brilliant boy with blue eyes as anything more than another sad casualty of Azanulbazar. But Dain knew that as long as he lived, he would remember Frin as he strived to build a legacy that lived up to his hero's dream. There was a strong grip around his neck. That was the first thing Bilbo registered as he stirred. He could feel a firm and tight hold around his neck. It was strong enough to hurt and bruise, but not so strong that he could no longer breathe. He struggled with it for a moment, trying to break free and pull back, but when he did, the grip simply tightened until it became hard to breathe. Panic began to set in, and he finally opened his eyes to stare at his sudden attacker. A Nazgul stared straight back at him. After meeting Azog and Gollum, Bilbo had been sure that he had seen the worst of the worst. But staring into the drooping eye sockets of the wraith before him, he realized he was quite wrong. The Nazgul resembled something like a living corpse. Its body was skeletal thin and covered by white skin that sagged in some places and pulled thin in others. Whatever hair it possessed had long ago turned white and thin and brittle. But the thing that unnerved him the most about the wraith were the eyes, red and sunken and so very, very empty. It was much like looking into the eyes of a corpse. "Hello," he greeted, because Baggins were bred for manners, even in the face of an ancient evil. "Could you let me go? You're kind of hurting me." To his disappointment, the Nazgul did not release him. Instead, it tightened its grip even more until he began to see spots in his vision. On instinct, he grabbed the wrist, choking him, and tried to claw it off to no avail. Soon darkness began to outline his vision as his lungs screamed for air and his throat seemed to grow smaller and smaller. Is this really how it's going to end? Then abruptly the wraith released him as it stood up. Bilbo collapsed to his knees and gasped for air desperately as his throat burned. He had only a moment to catch his breath before he was jerked to his feet by his hair. Hissing at the pain, he glared up at the Nazgul as it dragged him to where the four... Hissing at the pain, he glared up at the Nazgul as it dragged him to where four more wraiths sat upon their mounts. Once close enough, the wraith threw him to the floor, and he stumbled towards them before catching himself. Rubbing his hair, he peered up at the wraiths as they stared down at him. Fear was beginning to lick at his senses, making his skin turn cold and his hands shake. The black breath, the aura of the wraiths, was already beginning to affect him. Soon he knew he would lose conscious and possibly slip into shock before finally dying. Out of all the ways to go out, he found himself rather disappointed that it had turned out to be death by sleep. "Where is it?" asked one of the wraiths, its voice deep and controlled. Against his will, Bilbo flinched at the sound. That was a dark voice that carried centuries of murder and destruction in it. If death ever had a voice, then he had a feeling it would sound much like the Nazgul did. "Gone," he forced himself to say as he wrapped his arms around himself to fight the chill. "You know it is. You can feel it moving." The Nazgul seemed to tilt its head to the side, and he wondered if it was sneering. The Nazgul seemed to tilt its head to the side, and he wondered if it was sneering at him. "Irrelevant. We will retrieve it soon enough." Bilbo snorted softly and forced himself to glare up at the wraith from under his hair. "We'll see about that. We'll see about that." The wraith leaned forward in its saddle until the moonlight The wraith leaned forward in its saddle until the moonlight showed its face clearly. When it did, Bilbo flinched and stepped back before he could think. Though the ancient king was just as deformed as its companion, its silver eyes seemed somehow crueler. Those were the eyes of someone who enjoyed the twisted acts they committed in the name of an equally cruel master. "You fear us," the wraith said, its wrinkled mouth pulling back into a mockery of a smile. "As you should." "Not by choice," he argued back slowly. "Your magic forces me to fear you. Without it, I wouldn't be so shaken." The wrath drew back abruptly in one smooth motion. "Arrogant creature. If my master did not have need of you, then I would show you exactly why you should fear us." He blinked and felt his stomach drop. Need? "I am not going to kill you, Baggins," the creature reassured with clear mockery in his tone. "But once my master gets a hold of you, you will wish that I did." Bilbo did not get a chance to comprehend the wrath's horrifying words before everything went black once more. The next time he awoke, he found himself weak and being forcibly fed to something bitter and dry. He coughed and tried to pull away, but found himself unable to escape the hand around his jaw. With no other choice, he swallowed the plant and tried not to gag. Once he did, the hand around his jaw retreated and he was finally free. Slowly, he squinted up at the figure above him and found that it was a wraith. Damn. So it wasn't a horrible dream after all. The wraith ignored his look and lifted him up by his coat and sat him in the saddle of a nearby horse. He grabbed the mane of the horse on instinct and tried his best not to look down at the long, long drop below. Then to his surprise and discomfort, the wraith hoisted itself onto the horse and settled behind the hobbit easily enough. With a Nazgul so close, Bilbo could feel his head begin to throb and his vision blur. He clenched his fingers even tighter in the horse's mane and tried his best not to faint again. Around them he took note of the other wraiths, and then flinched as the wraith behind him shoved the small pouch in front of his face. "Eat this, or die," the Nazgul ordered, shaking the bag slightly. Slowly he reached up and took the pouch and looked inside. To his surprise, he found that it was filled with a weed that he had rarely seen but knew quite well. King's foil. They're giving me king's foil and are deliberately repressing their auras. They really do intend to keep me alive. Bilbo closed the bag and shoved it into his coat pocket for safekeeping. "Why am I still alive?" The wraith did not answer. "Where are we going?" "You will know when we get there," the Nazgul replied, and then nudged the horse into a gallop. Bilbo flinched again as together they left Dol Guldur and his friends behind. To his eternal surprise, traveling with 5 undead creatures that committed unspeakable crimes turned out to be a rather dull and boring experience. Other than the first night, the wraiths did not attempt to harm him, and honestly ignored him for the most part. The only time they gave him any sort of acknowledgement was when they gave him food, water, and of course kingsweed. When he attempted to refuse any of it, they forced him to eat or drink what he needed. They honestly did seem intent on keeping him alive at any cost. Though the wraiths did their best to keep their auras from affecting him, the hobbit still found himself sick and tired most of the time. He had a constant headache and a chill that he could not shake no matter what the time of day. If not for the wraiths, then he was sure he would have fallen asleep and would never awoken. Just to avoid the pain and cold. As the days went by, he realized that they were leaving Mirkwood behind for the south. When he finally made the connection, he felt his heart turn to ice because there was only one reason why they were traveling to the south, and it sure wasn't because it was warmer. They were going to Mordor. They were going to Sauron.